Professor Gompers, Professor Gandhi, thank you so much for speaking to me on NDTV. Let me start first by asking in terms of the big thing when you see, we're talking at a time when there's been an important meeting that has taken place between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. In your assessment, how do you see the larger India-US relationship going? It's not just about the politics aspect of it. I think economy and trade is going to be really central to this relationship going forward. Your thoughts on that, sir?
Yes, I think the U.S.-India relationship from an India perspective, if I kind of view that lens, is an extremely important one. I would say it's right up there, and for a variety of reasons. So one is on technology flow, like you said, and we can get into that more. The second is on capital flows. I mean, ultimately, India does need more capital to grow and sustain its economy. It's the highest growth large economy, but it is capital deficient. And so capital flows is the second one. Talent flows is the third one. So there's a huge number of areas where U.S.-India collaboration, I think, is actually, underperforming. And therefore, there's massive upside opportunity to kind of take it to the next step.
Professor Gompers, if you were to talk, about the technology aspect of it and also the kind of opportunities it throws up, the one very interesting thing between when, this meeting of the two heads of state was the focus on technology, whether it is biotech, whether it is semiconductors, whether it is defense. How do you see that helping and really becoming a catalyst for India when it comes to starting the ecosystem for all these technologies?
Yeah, so if we look at the last decade, one of the global success stories in sort of startups is clearly India. It's transition to an economy in which many of the best and brightest want to go. They want to start something. They want to build a national champion. And the last decade was really driven by companies focused on doing things in the Indian market. It's a huge market. You can build a multi-billion-dollar unicorn success by focusing on India. But I think that your question sort of is the right one, because if we look going forward, I think over the next decade, we're going to see almost as many global success stories. I think, India currently has, I think, something like 117 unicorns. But 98% of those are focused on the Indian market itself. I think what you're going to see is, given this new focus on collaboration, focus on technology, we're going to see centers of excellence in biotechnology, in AI, in other areas in which Indian startups and Indian technology will be sort of global leaders in many areas.
In fact, you spoke about AI. I wanted to come on that. There's also been an AI Action Summit. India was one of the co-chairs. Again, a lot of focus on the technologies of the future, which is AI. How do you see India's role in that, and how do you think that will build the ecosystem that one wants?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. So the first ingredient that India has in abundance is just talent. It's got great STEM education. It's got great universities. I think the piece which has sort of been growing is both the public and the private funding of the sort of the R&D component of that. And I think there'll be increasing global interest. Again, from one of the areas that I study is certainly sort of the venture capital space. And one of the things that we've seen is this increasing flow of capital, primarily from the US into India. And back to this point that I think that's been the biggest missing ingredient. It's got the talent, but you need the capital flows to fund the R&D, to fund sort of the science. And then we're going to see the emergence of these global winners.
I'm going to come to the semiconductor bit in just a while. You wanted to add on that? Professor Gandhi, go ahead, take this. Yeah.
So just adding on that, I think one of the key things, for example, there are a couple of examples of companies just on that in terms of the talent piece. So one of them told me that essentially a PhD in India with the same qualification and same caliber of a PhD, say, in the US, the US one costs 6x as to what an Indian PhD costs. And so if you think about having the same talent in terms of the R&D, because India has really been missing the whole aspect of deep tech. It's really been much more of SaaS and consumer facing, and how do we kind of scale it up quickly and things like that. So I think going forward, for India to become a bigger center of excellence, this tapping in of deep, high-quality talent, and not just the talent that kind of supports outsourcing and things like that, but this is deep research and development type of talent, along with longer-term capital orientation, is I think, which, as Professor Gompers just said, is really what is kind of going to change, in my view, in the next 10 years.
And do you see the role of the state, or how do you see the role of the state in that? Because yes, there is now a large, vibrant tech ecosystem in India. It is driven and geared towards specific industries. Mm-hmm. You mentioned consumer-facing yourself, but from a larger strategic point of view, others also need to be pushed. What do you think would be the role of the state there?
Yeah. So typically, the role of the state could be, providing a capital. But in this case, I think that the real role of the Indian state should be to facilitate the flowing of private capital. India, again, just given all the various demands, given the demands on education, healthcare, poverty alleviation, given all those demands, I think India has been lacking the capital to actually invest in long-term, deep tech-oriented opportunities. But what it should do is create or facilitate both, whether it be through fiscal incentive systems, through physical infrastructure, through various incentive systems to actually facilitate both private capital and private talent going into the area.
You want to add to that, sir?
Yeah. So I couldn't agree more. And what's interesting here, and you talk about sort of the recent meetings between Trump and Modi, that the time is now for India. So if we think about the current tensions between the US and China, and you were going to ask a second ago about semiconductors, there's a huge opportunity here for investment in semiconductor in India, given, again, both the engineering talent, the skills there. And so my own view is that if you set the playing field right, if you make it easier for private capital to come in, provide the infrastructure, I actually think that again, the opportunity in multiple sectors, semiconductors, AI, and the like, is absolutely enormous.
How do we sort of plug the gap? I mean, you mentioned, I'm going to come to you, sir, which is that you mentioned that we need to get some of those factors right. We have talent. We need to build in on the infrastructure. But if you were to probably just highlight, let's say, the top two ingredients for the sake of simplifying, which is, of course, a very important and a layered conversation. But to simplify it, if there were top two conditions that you would want specifically for semiconductors.
So specifically for semiconductors, one, I think the infrastructure has to be put in place to support the semiconductor industry. And then the second thing are on regulations about capital flows and incentives to bring that capital in. And if we think about some of the countries which have done it really, really well, look at Singapore, for example. Singapore is a tiny country, but the flow of both talent and capital into Singapore is driven by the fact that it's easy, the business regulations have been massively simplified. You've got the regulatory controls around capital, again, far simplified. And so what I would say is that relying on the private sector and allowing the private sector to operate in a way that isn't so regulatory heavy is probably the biggest and most important factor in my mind.
Professor Gandhi, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so adding to that, in terms of the China plus one strategy, is building on what Professor Gompers just said. So the China plus one strategy in India has been somewhat successful. If you think about it, but a few years ago, there were no iPhones being built in India. Now, a reasonable percentage of iPhones are being built in India. There's other examples like that, whether it be in automobiles. But again, when I speak with folks who are doing this, that there was so much more that could be done, and so much more could have come out of will come out of this meeting that you refer to that's just happened. But there still are a lot of hurdles. There are, whether it be regulation, whether it be land acquisition, whether it be labor laws and kind of clearing up this labor law. So there's given the policy pronouncements here in the last couple of years, I think the government clearly recognizes that, but I do think more could be done. The other thing I would say is that because, given the federal system, you'll see that there are clearly some states that have actually done a lot of this, are getting a disproportionate share of capital flowing in. And so therefore there are good examples of taking that kind of those, what I would say, best in class and scaling them up.
Yeah, so there are some enclaves of successful government policy and that have attracted more investments and more needs to be done. But the fact is some of these are state subjects, so you cannot have central laws when it comes to land being one of them. Such a political hot potato. But coming back to, you mentioned the China plus one and the supply chains. Under President Trump, how do you see that evolving and allowing India, or do you see that allowing India more opportunities? Because that could also mean probably, the nature of Quad also changing from being almost like a soft power where, it's more about disaster recovery and, vaccines and that to becoming more about supply chains, Do you see that evolution happening and allowing India the opportunity? And how do you see that coming through in the next couple of years?
No, I clearly see that as an opportunity. So it's one of the things where there's the government policy or dialogue, but ultimately supply chains are driven by the private sector. And so it's really the private companies that are, disproportionately perhaps reliant on China to kind of move that to India. And there again, that's where the policy comes in. I think a lot more will happen. I would say that the production-linked incentive scheme that the government has put in place has been positively received. I think it's structured in a way that, stimulates investment in the near term, but takes away subsidies in the long term once performance targets are met. And I think those are the kind of policies which need to be continued. But once you see more dialogue happening at the government to government level, I do think that it also encourages the private sector then to do more, because you're seeing a kind of political. As far as the Quad goes, I really don't have a point of view on that. It was set up more as a political kind of system. So I'm not sure whether the Quad really would replace or be a kind of a trade block for supply chains. I mean, I think Australia, Japan, India are going to kind of do their own thing from a supply chain standpoint.
Sure. The only reason I said that is because under President Trump, it could just be going in a different direction. But, coming to the tech part of it, and the other aspect, we spoke about talent, we spoke about how there is a lot of, Indian talent, which sort of also pushes a lot of the IT sector and tech industries here in America. But we also talk at a time when there's been a lot of discussion around should tech talent from India be allowed here freely, or should there be more barriers that should be created? Of course, there is a political connotation to this conversation, but that has really been amplified, hasn't it, sir? Yeah. Whether you take the H-1B visas or whether you take any other form of allowing more tech talent from India to enter, how do you see that evolving and going?
I recently wrote a paper where we looked at all the founders of US-backed venture-backed companies, and we were able to identify the immigrants versus the American founders. And what we found is that 22% of US venture-backed tech founders are immigrants who came for either their education or to work. But the interesting thing is that that 22% is far more successful. So if you compare that 22% to, say, American-founded companies, they have something like, the returns are 50% higher, more likely to go public, and so they're far more successful. So the U.S. clearly benefits from this. How does India benefit? One of the things that we've actually seen, and we have the data to show this as well, is that there's a huge returning population. So one of the things that we've seen over the last really 5 to 7 years is that as the tech and startup scene in India has flourished and grown, we've actually seen a reverse brain drain, in which more and more of the sort of Indian founders and those who have joined startups are returning and starting that next generation of companies in India. And so I actually think this flow of talent in and out of the U.S., it's great for the U.S., but I actually think it's great for India. And especially if we think about moving to deep tech, I think it's going to be the seeds of many of the best deep tech companies in India, where sort of Indians who have come to the U.S., have experience in the top U.S. deep tech companies, are going to see the opportunity to build something on a global scale in India. And so my own view is this is a good thing.
You want to come in on that, sir? The reverse brain drain that Professor Gompers was talking about?
Yeah, So I could maybe do it from, since we are sitting here at the Harvard Business School. So this is not technologists or the scientists, but if I look at just MBA students, compared to say 5 or 10 years ago, where Indian MBA students would want to stay back in the US, I'm seeing, I have a bunch of my own students in the last 3-4 years who have now startups. They're in Bangalore, who are basically gone right back. They were actually working on their business plans while they were here, with the whole intention of going back. And so so you take the business education piece of it, you couple that with engineers and qualified PhDs, and you put that together. I think that's going to be a killer combination going forward.
When you talk about the trade relationship between India and US, there's been a clear intent to increase that going forward. It's about $120 billion. The public intent is to double it in the next 5 to 6 years. What shape and form will that take? Because it cannot be that the industries that are doing well will be the ones that'll double up, right? How do you, as someone who understands business, as someone who knows where this future business would really lie, where do you see that growth potential really coming in for the bilateral trade to really increase from its present to double?
So I think there's a variety of areas, and also it could again be part of the China 1+ strategy, because so much of it right now, India's largest trade partner actually is China. So again, from a personal national security perspective, that there's an incentive to do that. But I think some of the things which was talked about, like whether it be space, defense, and I think even just basic things like consumer products, there is actually the opportunity to increase that flow between the two countries remains very high. It has been underperforming. I guess the counter to that would be that I'm not sure where the announcement around tariffs, at least what I read, is that the biggest negative impact on that would be on India and Brazil. So that's a big question mark in my mind, that if tariffs kind of go up and things become, the barriers are kind of put up, whether this doubling, it's hard for me to see how trade doubles when tariffs go up, at least in the near term.
Your thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, so maybe I'm a little bit more of an optimist here. I think that certainly the Trump administration is using tariffs to get what they want. But I think strategically, if you think about where would the Trump administration want to source products and technology products and the like, it's not going to be China. Back to the iPhone example again. I think that when we look, and if we think about sort of the tech sector broadly, I think there's a tremendous opportunity to build value-added sort of tech sort of facilities and production and the like in India, because and if I think about whether it be Apple, whether it be Google, whether it be any of these other tech companies, even in the biomedical space, you talked about that as well. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity, and I think the Trump administration would much rather build those kinds of bilateral trade relationships today with India as opposed to China, given some of the tensions that we've actually seen. And so while tariffs are waived as sort of this, listen, you need to give me what I want, I actually think at the end of the day, if I had to guess, 5 years from now, all of this will have been to the benefit of India.
And how much of a tool are they from a geopolitical point of view?
Interesting question. We can only speculate in terms of the inner workings of what President Trump thinks. But certainly, whether we see it on sort of the trade and business side, whether we see it in sort of geopolitical conflicts, he portrays himself as being somewhat crazy, and I think he does this in a shrewd way to try and get an agreement. So again, we can all have our assessment of whether or not we think that's good or bad, but I think he throws out crazy potential policies, and at the end of the day, there will be agreements.
So professors can get away by calling heads of state all sorts of things. Journalists, unfortunately, do not have that luxury. I won't say any of that. But let me then ask you this about we speaking about geostrategic, geopolitical aspects. The one thing that I also want to touch upon is that there is a huge expectation that the Russia-Ukraine war is set to end. Whatever may be the political solution, how do you see the larger impact of that? Because it's been an overhang. It's been an overhang from an economic point of view, from a trade point of view. You take the commodities market, all of it have seen an overhang of that war. If it comes to an end, how do you see that reshaping global trade, global finance? And that's a question to both of you.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I'm not sure I'm quite qualified to answer that question, quite honestly.
No, I'm just asking from
So-
a understanding point of view.
Yeah, no, I mean, so again, I'm not going to express my own policies on this, but I mean, clearly, given the close relationships that India's had with both Russia and the U.S., I think to the extent that there is a reasonable peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, again, I think that goes to the benefit of India, because I think it stabilizes both those relationships. And again, I'm not going to speak about where I think it should end, but I think if it were to end, I think that would be on a macro level good for India.
Mm-hmm. You don't want to add anything to that, sir? I mean, I wanted to.
Well, clearly it would be. India has come under a lot of pressure when the war broke out on reducing its relationship with Russia.
Economy point of view.
Yeah.
So look, from a global economy point of view, when a conflict comes to an end and there's more certainty on the future, that's always good, right? So and that, I know it's a very general kind of comment, but the fact of the matter is that when a big conflict comes to an end, there'll be more stability going forward. There's more comfort in capital flows, more comfort in making long-term investments. So from that perspective, I mean, a war coming to an end can only be a good thing for the world.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah. But okay, so final question to both of you, which is the, I think that is important for our viewers to also sort of get a sense of when we talk about A, India-US relationship, B, India's future. What, according to you, would be that one thing that you would watch out for that could really change the game when you talk about India's future potential?
As I mentioned, and I think we alluded to this a little bit earlier, when we see India's Google or we see India's sort of Microsoft coming out, I think we will know that the foundation which was laid over the last 15 or 20 years has borne its fruit. And I think we will. I think we'll see global tech winners coming out of India. And for me, I think we'll know that India has arrived.